Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Salamat pagi sa niya. I am Francisco Rosario Jr. from the Department of Linguistics, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, University of the Philippines in Diliman. The UP Department of Linguistics is distinctly focused on the scientific study, preservation, and promotion of Philippine languages and dialects through teaching, archiving, research, and publication. It is also mandated to use its research expertise to address language issues in the country. Aside from Philippine linguistics, the department is also recognized as an expert in the teaching of the national languages of Asia. It is designated as a center of excellence in foreign languages by the Philippines Commission on Higher Education. I would like to welcome everyone who is tuned in to the Talks on Asian Languages. Talks on Asian Languages, or the TAL series, serves as an avenue for faculty members and alumni of the UP Department of Linguistics, including our colleagues from other institutions teaching Asian languages, for them to share their research about second language learning and acquisition. Each lecture will focus on how linguistics and pedagogical trends can be employed and adapted to fit the learning needs of Filipino students. This lecture is being live streamed on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. To our audience, please use the comment section to type in your questions and comments, and we will be reading this during the Q&A portion and will be addressed by our guest speaker after the presentation. So today we're happy to have with us Dr. Jerome Samuel. Jerome Samuel is a full professor at INALCO, or the National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilizations, focusing on Indonesian and Malaysian studies. He is currently the director of IRASEC, or the Research Institute on Contemporary Southeast Asia, and an associate researcher at CASE. He is also the chief editor of the journal Archipel, Interdisciplinary Studies on the Insulindian World. His work focuses on Malay terminologies, language policies, didactics, interdialectal mutual intelligibility, and in a completely different field, on reverse glass painting in Indonesia. So, to deliver a lecture titled Comparing Language Policies in Malay-speaking Countries, from Colonial Legacies to Political Will and Constraints, let us all welcome Dr. Jerome Samuel.
Thank you. Is it my turn to speak now? Okay, so I would like to thank the Department of Linguistics of the University of the Philippines and Diliman for inviting me to deliver this speech on a subject which has been at the center of my interest for so many years. And with this presentation entitled Comparing Language Policies in Malay-speaking Countries from Colonial Legacies and to Political Will and Constraints, I would like to explain how far the legacy from the colonialists, as well as the political will and the constraints in the contemporary world, have shaped the language policies in the Malay-speaking countries. In Southeast Asia, there are 4 Malay-speaking countries, which are Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. And additionally, there are all other countries where Malay forms of Malay are used but not as official languages, like the southern part of the Thailand and the Timor-Leste. So I'll speak about these 4 countries, and I'm trying to skip to the next. Yeah. And at first I would like to make sure that when we are speaking about Malay and Malay varieties, we are using the same terms. So here it's important to give a definition of the denominations that we'll be using all along this presentation. First, Malay with small caps refers to all variants of Malay, all, including standard and non-standard. Malay or Malays as a plural form with capital for the initial and small letters refers mainly to vernacular Malays. Anyone, and there are a lot of vernacular Malays in Indonesia and Malaysia, including in Brunei and Singapore too, like Melayu Malay, Melayu Manado, Melayu Ambon, Ambonese Malay, or Melayu Kelantan, Kelantanese Malay, or Johor, Melayu Johor, Johor Malay, etc., etc. Besides this, we have two official and standard variants of Malay, that is Indonesian, official language of Indonesian, Malay or Malaysian. I explain later what's the difference between Malay and Malaysian for Malaysia, referring to the official language of the Federation of Malaysia. And lastly, there are two local variants which are used widely as substandards. The first one is Jakartanese, which is used in the slightly different form as a national substandard in Indonesia. And lastly, the Melayu Brunei, which is or Bruneian, which is a Malay dialect of Brunei Darussalam, and which plays a special role in this small country. So, what's important here as a starting point too is to make a clear difference between four groups or subgroups of Malays with different functions and uses and places where these languages are used. First, we have the national standardized Malays, Malay or Malaysian and Indonesian. Secondly, here we have the national substandard Malay, as I've mentioned it, Bruneian in Brunei, Jakartanese in Indonesia, and in Malaysia it's less clear, but maybe the Klang Valley Malay, which is spoken around Kuala Lumpur, could play such a role. And beside this, we have vehicular Malays spoken in wider regions, like in regions in Indonesia, in southern part of Kalimantan, who have the Banjaris, Banjar, Melayu Banjar, or in the northern part of Sulawesi, you have Melayu Manado, Manadonese Malay, or in Sarawak, you have the Melayu Sarawak too. And lastly, on the lower stage, we have local vernacular Malay, like Melayu Kelantan, Melayu Baba, which is spoken in Malacca and in Singapore, or was spoken there, Melayu Johor, in the southern tip of the peninsula, Melayu Deli, spoken in the northern part of Sumatra, Melayu Ternate, which is spoken in Ternate, in northern Maluku, etc., etc. And we must underline something which is important, namely, it's that all these variants of Malay usually are surrounded by other languages which are not necessarily closely related to Malay. And Malay, except in the peninsula, Malaysia, is very rarely the majority language spoken at any places. So I began, and in the title of my presentation, I mentioned the legacy of the colonials, of the colonialists. And the colonial times, you have this large region divided into two parts. The first one is the Netherlands of Dutch Indies, and the other one is are the British possessions, British colonies. And both parts have been colonized for more than 1 century, around 120 or 130 years, besides the presence of the Dutch and the British before the 19th century, of course. So for a long time, and most of the colonial language policy would have been run by the Dutch and the British, because Dutch as well as British have had the colonial policy in the field of language. Most have been done in the first decades of the 20th century. In both colonies, Malay was used for the second part of the 19th century and all along the 20th century as a kind of second official language for diplomacy, for administration, and in schools, especially in the Dutch Indies. And Malay has been used in the vernacular press, and more specifically and much more in the Dutch possessions compared to the British ones. And the Malay at that time was competing with other languages, the language of the colonials, British English and Dutch, as well as other Asian languages, mainly Chinese languages, Hokkien, Hakka, Teochew, and local languages like Javanese, Sundanese, and many other local languages. What has been done during the colonial times is a kind of appropriation of Malay for fulfilling new needs for administration, for education, and the colonial have taken the Malay as an object of study and which they have described for their own needs. And they have produced many dictionaries and grammars too, many tools to better know and use in their understanding of that word of the language. The main efforts of codification have been made by a Dutch named Van der Puysen, with 2 books published in 1901 and 1910, and for the British possession by another colonialist named Wilkinson, with a book and the dictionary published and the script published in 1904. So now I would like to begin to describe one by one all the countries with the linguistic situation, and the policies which have been enforced during the colonial times and after that. So since the middle of the 20th century until the present. And if we speak about the Malay Indonesia, we have to notice that it has been built on a very strong narrative. First, before beginning, I would like just to underline the fact that with the picture you have under your eyes, with the Indonesian flag, with the Indonesian emblem, the bird Garuda, you may read the motto, the Indonesian motto below, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which means, roughly speaking, unity in diversity. But this is not written in Indonesian. This is written in Old Javanese, just to make sure that beside Indonesian and Malay, you have many other very prestigious languages, including Javanese and Old Javanese. So everything began during the 1910 and 1920s. At that time, the early nationalists were living in a completely different linguistic setting or context. Most of these young nationalists, didn't that much speak Malay. They were Javanese or Sundanese, with Javanese and Sundanese as their mother tongue, and they grew up with Dutch, which they learned at school, and they were much more fluent in Dutch and in their mother tongue, rather in Malay. But quickly, language became a very important political issue, whereby Malay or different forms of Malay were competing between each other and competing with Dutch, as a focus in the mind of the young nationalists was their vow or their intention to reach independence for Indonesia, and what could be the main tool to maintain the unity of the country. So it could have been something like religion, but all Indonesians were not and are not Muslim. That could have been the principle built by the colonials themselves, but they were fighting against the colony, so it wasn't possible. And languages became something very convenient to underline the unity of the country and the need to strengthen it for the future. And in 1928, during a youth congress, the second youth congress held in Jakarta or Batavia that year in November, the young nationalists, they had an oath, that they took an oath, which main words here are written in blue, in bold blue characters: one fatherland, Tanah Indonesia; one nation, Bangsa Indonesia; and the language of unity, Bahasa Indonesia. So we have the fatherland, Indonesia, the nation, Indonesian nation, and the language, which is not the unique language of the nation, of the country, but which is the language of unity. And this formulation is very important because it says quite clearly that in that country, you have plenty of languages, actually more than 700, but one plays a special role as a garant of unity of the country. So what makes it acceptable for the people, for the Indonesian people, or for the Indonesian elite at that time? It's first Indonesian, which clearly refers to Malay. It refers to Malay for one single reason: is the oath I've read to you in the former slide. The oath is written in Malay, or in the form of Malay that people will call Indonesian instead of calling it just Malay. And Malay is an old and prestigious and neutral language. It's old, written since the 8th century, prestigious, used for diplomacy, for religion since the 14th and the 15th century, and neutral. Why is it natural? It's natural because it's spoken by small communities spread all over the country, and it's not the majority language. It's a minority language, but spread in the whole archipelago from the northern part of Sumatra, Aceh, northern Sumatra, to the Moluccas in the southeastern part of Indonesia. And there are very few alternatives to Malay at that time. Actually, just two alternatives were possible. The first one was Dutch, but Dutch was clearly refused by the nationalists. And the other one, Javanese, spoken by 2/3 of the population, but Javanese was hardly acceptable for the other population of the archipelago, especially in the western part of Java, where not Javanese, but Sundanese is spoken, and more specifically, outside of Java, where practically no one speaks Javanese. At that time, so in the late 20s and during the 30s, the people didn't try to define Indonesian. It was clearly not necessary to do so, to define it. It was dangerous because that matter was highly politicized. So the people and the nationalists were just speaking about Bahasa Indonesia, the Indonesian language, avoiding to use the term Malay, preferring the term Indonesia, which is much more politicized instead of Malay, but they avoid to define it because of the political implication, because it was refused by the colonials, and because it was difficult to define it. We have to keep in mind that most of the nationals at that time, they don't speak so fluently Indonesian or Malay, and for them, Indonesian was much more referring to the lingua franca used in Java specifically, or in the archipelago, rather than to more prestigious variant of Malays. For the colonials at that time, there were two forms of Malay, the Low Malay and High Malay. Low Malay, spoken in markets, High Malay, which is literally a variant of Malay. Luckily, for the local society and for the Indonesians, as well for the Javanese, as well people of Batavia, Jakarta, as well for the Chinese communities in the archipelago, there were a lot of dialects, a lot of variants, including two important and specifically important dialects: Sino-Malay, which refers to the kind of Malay spoken by the Chinese community in the northern coast of Java, and Betawi, which referred to the Malay dialect used in Batavia or Jakarta. After 1928, the Indonesian nationalists, they held the Congress for Indonesia in Surabaya in 1938, trying to not to define a language, what's Indonesian, but to define a future language policy for Indonesia. And after that decade, we have key years. First of all, the Japanese occupation between 1942 and 45. During that time, the use of Dutch was completely forbidden by the Japanese. So everywhere, Indonesian or Malay had to replace Dutch, which was not an easy task. And in 1945, with the first constitution, or the only one actually, constitution of Indonesia, the status of Indonesian was clearly stated as the state language of Indonesia. Bahasa negara ialah bahasa Indonesia. And after that, after the Independence War, the status and the position of Indonesian was accepted, since that time accepted by all, and including by the colonials. It is accepted, and it was and still accepted by all, as the language of unity, and two, which is important too, as the language of modernity and change. So the language of your new country, built in 1945, or established in 1945. So you have a language policy in Indonesia which has not much changed since that time until now, with the national language, Indonesian, regional languages, which are not specifically mentioned in the constitution, but acknowledged in other official texts. National language, Indonesian, is used and taught through education, and widely used through the press and in the public space since that time, with various attitude towards the standards. In the 1970s, 1990s, the stress was put on the standard, bahasa Indonesia yang baik dan benar, a good and correct Indonesian, although most of the people didn't speak that variant. But since 1998, there is a better public acceptance for the substandard, which is a kind of a form of Jakartanese. So, officially speaking, you have that kind of relations between Indonesian at the top of the triangle, and at the bottom, foreign languages as a possible enrichment and a threat to the national language on one side, and the other side, the regional languages, maybe not all of it, but mainly the big regional languages, Javanese, Sundanese, Balinese, Minangkabau, and many others, who can enrich and protect or maybe threaten the national languages. So a very ambiguous positioning of Indonesian towards foreign languages and regional languages. During that time and until now, we have the figure until 2010, but things haven't yet much changed since. You can see that, we start from a point in 1928, before the independence, whereby less than approximately 5% of the population was able to speak Malay, and now almost all the population, for 5 years and more, is able to speak in Indonesian, which raises two questions. The first one is, what does it mean to be able to speak Indonesian? What kind of proficiency is needed to say from oneself that he or she speaks Indonesian? And beside this, what is a native speaker? This is not really clear, because there are no native speaker of Indonesian or formal studied Indonesian in Indonesia. No, there are people who have other mother tongues. So, because studied Indonesian is never a mother tongue, and so we can speak about these Indonesian speaker as non-native. They are unnative. They are not native. They are not non-native, but unnative. So non-native, but surrounded by the language itself. I skip this and the following on, which explain differently the relationships between standard Indonesian and other languages, regional and substandard Malays in cities and in the countryside. So just to stress the fact that, as the final slide for this part for Indonesian, that diglossia is something very important, a very important feature of the language in Indonesia. Actually, diglossia is not the best word or the best term to be used. We should speak about the tree or a kind of polyglossia, whereby most of the people have a mother tongue, for example, Javanese, and beside this, they are exposed to the standard, and sometimes they will use the standard, and in other situations, they will use the substandard of Indonesian instead of Indonesian and their own mother tongue. But diglossia in Indonesia, as well as in other countries, or generally is the case in any country, there is no official discourse and no official recognition of diglossia. The country and the administration only recognizes the standard Indonesian, although all the people, everyone, including the people working in the public service, including the politicians, of course, they very often speak in substandard Indonesian. Now we shift to Malaysia with a language, Malay, which can be said as or considered as an unshared language or very badly shared. Here you have the motto of and the emblem of Malaysia with the same kind of motto as in Indonesia: unity is strength. So here the focus is put on the unity, and the unity around Malay and Malayness. The motto is in Malay, and the stress is put on Islam too. You can see the star and the moon and the crescent. And besides this, you can notice that in the right part of the motto, the words are written in what's called in Jawi script, which is the Arabic script used for Malay. Bersekutu bertambah mutu. Malaysia is divided in two parts: Western, the peninsula, and Eastern are the northern part and northern coast of Borneo. Smaller country than Indonesia, around 25 million of inhabitants, roughly speaking. A lot of languages, 142. I didn't get the figure for Indonesian, but Indonesia is 270 million of people and more than have 700 languages. So Malaysia is much smaller. One specificity of Malaysia is the country is divided in three races. The word is officially used in Malaysia, three races: Malays, Chinese, and Indians, and has one official language only, Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Malaysia. Both denominations are used. I explained it later. And it's a federation consisting in 13 states, including 9 sultanates. So the British legacy concerns mainly the place and the role of the Malays. So the British, during their time in the peninsula mainly, they redefined what are the Malay, and they built the idea of a Malay race, and they put the Malayness on the peninsula, and the Malay race and the Malay people are at the heart of Malayness, which is was considered as very important by the colonial and still considered important and essentially crucial for the Malay and for Malaysia up to now. During that time, especially from the late 19th century until the first decades of the 20th century, the peninsula as well as the eastern part of Malaysia experienced a massive migratory flows from India and China. Very important, to the point that at the end of the colonial time, the Malays almost became a minority in the peninsula, clearly, and as well, and more clearly even in the eastern part of Malaysia. And this notion of Malay race is important in terms of racialization of ethnic groups, hierarchization of these ethnic groups too, and classification of the groups. So the the British put the Malay at the bottom in terms of strength, in terms of will, but they put them at the top in terms of governance and in the elites and the role they would have to play in the future independent nation. And they tend to close the notion and the definition of Malayness. It's remained open for a long time, but time after time it became more and more crystallized and closed. The consequence of the British rule was the two ideas which became the foundation, the ideological foundation of the state independence since 1957. And these concepts are clearly written in the constitution of Malay primacy, Ketuhanan Melayu, and Malayness, Kemelayuan. So we have here a state which is dominated, according to the constitution, by Malays. One very important moment since the independence of Malaysia was riots of May 1969 between Chinese and Malays, mainly in Kuala Lumpur, which became a trauma for the country. And as a consequence of these events, the Malays enforced a positive discrimination in favor of Malays to enhance the position in the economic field. They enforced a new education policy stressing Malay language, and they forbid for the future any debate on the status of languages, Malay as well as Chinese. They redenominate or change the name of the national language. Until 1957, it was called Bahasa Melayu, Malay, so the language of a single community. And after 1969, in the 70s, it became Bahasa Malaysia, which refers to the whole country. But after that, the name changed again and again. So we can see the Malaysian country as a fragmented nation with two main categories, Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra. Bumiputra are people of the natives, actually. Non-Bumiputra are the descendants of the migrants, Chinese and Indian migrants. And within these two major groups, we have subgroups. We have a subgrouping differentiating between, for the non-Bumiputra, between Chinese and Indians, and for the Bumiputra, differentiating between the Malay and the non-Malay. The non-Malay are the natives of the peninsula, very few people, very few groups, and the natives of Borneo in Sabah and in Sarawak. The same concept of Bumiputra exists in Indonesia too, with its different name, Pribumi, but the meaning is the same. But the main difference between Indonesia and Malaysia is Bumiputra in Malaysia is a legal category, which is not the case for Pribumi in Indonesia. So the language policies reflect clearly the division of the population and the specific and the special position recognized or given to the Malay in the constitution, as I've explained it already. Malaysia or Malay or Malaysian is the so unique national languages recognized in the country, although there are guarantees for other languages. English has a special position too, was recognized temporarily as co-official language, and since 2015 is recognized in Sabah and in Sabah only as the co-official language. As you can understand, the state and even the Malay themselves are not very comfortable with this situation, and this discomfort is reflected by the changing denomination for the national languages. In 1957, Bahasa Melayu, 1969, Bahasa Malaysia, and then in 1986, again Bahasa Melayu, and finally, since 2007, Bahasa Malaysia. This Until now, most of the Malay, when they're asked what's the name of the national language, they will not answer. They won't answer Bahasa Malaysia. They will answer Bahasa Melayu. But for their own comfort and for the comfort of all components of the population, usually people, when they are speaking about the national language, they won't name it as Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Malaysia. They will name it as BM. And BM is completely neutral. M can be Melayu as well as Malaysia. Malay, of course, is used in education with a kind of Malayization of education. But for other communities, Chinese and Indian communities, you will find national type schools, which are private schools run by Chinese and by Tamils, whereby Malay is taught as a subject. So the Chinese and the Tamil, they do learn Malay, but they don't use it as widely as it is the case for the Malays themselves in the public schools or private schools for them. English plays a role, an important role. English was set aside for a few years in the 70s, and then it came back during the 80s. There was a huge reversal in the 1990s with the Education Act of 1996, more specifically, and a kind of hegemony of English attempted by the state for 6 years in the first decade of the 2000s, but now the role of English in the primary and secondary school has been lowered, but remains and is more and more important, specifically in the higher education system. The minority languages are completely set aside, almost completely set aside from the education system in Malaysia. Very few of these languages are taught in the schools. The result of this education policy is the diffusion of Malay, although Malay is not really, usually most of the Chinese and big part of the Indians do not have a good command of Malay, or they do not consider themselves as having a good command of Malay. There is, in the chat room, there is a question from Jam, but I answer the question later. So thank you for asking, but I prefer to go on first. So the importance of the development in the language situation is now, time after time, Malay is becoming mainly the language of the Malay community instead of being really the national language. It's competing with English in the public space, specifically in cities. So in big cities, especially in Kuala Lumpur, the language used for communication between communities or with someone you don't know what is his racial background will be English. It's a language of politeness. In the countryside, it's completely different, and Malay remains of utmost importance. But in cities, English is having a more and more important place and role to play, with a specific local variation, which is called Manglish, Malaysian English, but I won't elaborate further on Manglish. For the other communities, for the Chinese and Indian communities, the situation of the Chinese languages is really important, because now you see a decrease of the use in the use of Hokkien, Fuzhou, Touzhou, Hakka, Cantonese, etc., beside the rise of Mandarin. So Mandarin is becoming the main common language for Chinese communities. As for the Indian languages, this community it's becoming more and more heterogeneous, whereby before until the middle of the 19th century, the Indian communities were mainly Malayalam-speaking or Tamil-speaking populations, and now you have these migrant workers coming from Punjab, who who are speaking Punjabi, or for Bengal speaking Bengali, or from Nepal speaking Nepali. And we see a wider range of Indian languages spoken in Malaysia. Brunei, very shortly, it's really an interesting case. Here, the flag and the motto of Brunei, partly in Arabic and partly in Malay, but both with Arabic script. It's a very small Malay state, 500,000 inhabitants, but only 327,000 of nationals. All other people are migrants or are Chinese people whose ancestors were already living in Brunei, but for who the Bruneian nationality hasn't been recognized in 1984, where Brunei became independent. So they have been expelled from the national community. 3 races. The concept of races is clearly a British legacy: Malay, Chinese, and others. But the definition of Malay is slightly different in Brunei compared to Malaysia. Malay in Malaysia is different from natives of the peninsula and natives from Borneo. Whereas in Brunei, Malays combines both Malay itself and natives. So the definition of Malay in Brunei is broader, wider. Non-Malay, so Chinese, are clearly marginalized in Brunei much more than they are in Malaysia, although they play a role in the economic life and in the administration as well. 15 languages only, including 6 Malay dialects in Brunei. In Brunei, you have 3 main languages. Malay, the official language, Bahasa Melayu, which is exactly the same as the Malaysian standards. English, which has a very important role in the economic life, in higher education, as well as in the administration. And Bruneian. Bruneian is a vernacular, Bahasa Melayu Brunei. It's a quite diverging dialect, but used luckily for wider communication, including between different communities. And beside this, Bruneian is considered the linguistic identity marker of the Brunei, of the Sultanate of Brunei. And finally, if we consider the position and the role of the language towards the state, in the state, in Brunei, as well as in Malaysia, you have the preeminence of the Malays, of course. And this is clearly stated in the name of the national ideology, Islam Melayu Beraja, whereby you find Islam as the unique religion recognized in the Sultanate, Melayu for the main cultural role and place in the Sultanate, and Beraja because the king or the Sultan is the anchor or is at the center of the country. So related to this national ideology, I just have one thing to add and explain, is the role and the function of what people call the Bahasa Dalam. Bahasa Dalam exists in Brunei as well as in Malaysia, and you have that kind of languages of place in other countries in Southeast Asia. But in other countries of Southeast Asia, the language of the place is reducing, is disappearing Java, disappearing in the peninsula. It's still important in Thailand and in Cambodia too. It's expanding in Brunei, and it's playing a more and more important role. So it's the language you have to use when you are speaking to the king, to the sultan, or to its relatives. It's a kind of honorific too, but it plays a political and ideological role, although most of the Bruneian don't really understand and speak that Bahasa Dalam, which is basically Malay, but with specific terms and words. Finally, Malay in Singapore. Singapore is the land of social engineering, and the language plays a very important role in that policy. Speaking of Singapore, we have to underline the fact that here you can see traces of the past everywhere in the immediate linguistic environment, in the name of places, of the kampungs or the streets, etc. You have here Chinese Teochew, Chinese Mandarin, Chinese Hokkien. You have Malay too, Bukit Panjang, and you have British too with Queenstown or Clementi. So it's a mixing place. The legacy is almost the same as in Malaysia, with a big difference. The majority of the population is Chinese, and Malay are a minority. So you have a partition of the society into races, with Malays, although it's minority, are the original occupants of the city. There were 60% of the population in the early 19th century, but by the end of the century, Chinese became the majority of the population, over than 60%, and now, right now, it's approximately 75% of the population. And besides this, you have Indians and British. The linguistic heritage is threefold. First, British English, which now is spoken by everyone in Singapore, but at the time of right before the independence, British English was spoken by less than 2% of the population. Besides this, you have Malay, Melayu Pasar, Bahasa Malay, a kind of vehicular Malay, a lingua franca, which now is just spoken by Malay people, Malay population. But before the independence, was used by almost half of the population. And finally, Chinese, and mainly Southern Chinese languages, with an important feature, the fact that, again, right before the independence in 1957, less than 1% of the people of the population in Singapore was native speaker of Mandarin. So Mandarin was practically not used in Singapore. So at first, Singapore should have been part of Malaysia, but finally, Singapore in 1965 were expelled from the Federation of Malaysia. Why? Because in Malaysia, the elites wanted to set up a Malay dominance. The Malay of the peninsula didn't want to share the power, as I've explained formally. And in Singapore, it was the opposite, with the majority of the population being Chinese, where the Chinese elite rejected the kind of discriminatory policy which was enforced in the peninsula. So the Malay of the peninsula, the Malay of Malaysia, they just expelled Singapore, which became an independent country against its own will at first. And here, the political elite set up a kind of social engineering, partly based or including the language from the mid-60th centuries until now. The goal of this linguistic language and social engineering was to preserve the cohesion of a multicultural and multi-ethnic society, with a symbolic recognition of a Malay anteriority, but which was mainly based on English and lessly on other languages. So you have 3.5 million of citizens, and you have additionally almost 2 million of resident, non-citizen residents, so it's very important. 20 languages, mostly foreign or languages introduced in the island during the colonial era of after, and 4 races. Wine again, we find this British legacy, 4 races among the citizen, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others, mainly British or Portuguese or Jewish. 4 languages are recognized. 1 as national language, Malay, and 4 as official languages. So Malay, English, Mandarin, and Tamil. Mandarin as the unique Chinese language recognized in the island, and Tamil as considered as the main Indian language used in the island, although it's not the only one, of course. So the goal of the language policy is to ensure the unity and survival of the Republic. It aims to regulate communitarianism, to open up to the world through English, and to balance between own values, anchors, and foreign values. Own values, local, national values, considered as protecting the country, and foreign values considered as threatened or endangering the countries, but bringing prosperity as well. And with 3 very important principles. First one is equivalence of all languages, but this is much theoretical. Actually, one language is more important than the others, British, English, and the other one, Mandarin, is more important than Malay and in the daily life, and Tamil, of course. Second principle is the complementarity of English versus mother tongues, other official languages. So English for the opening to the world, for the foreign values, mother tongues for the local own national values, and for the regulation of the communitarianism too. And third principle, the replacement or the substitution of one language, English, for others, including Chinese, for a very wide range of functions. English, so, is the language of the main language based on national economic imperative. It's a common language. Everyone speaks English now. It was not the case 40 and 50 years ago. It's a neutral language, not ethnicized, for the sake of national cohesion, of course, and it's key to modernity, to mobility, to economic success, and to international integration. Additionally, we must underline the fact that Mandarin plays a role as a tool to enter the Chinese market of the Popular Republic of China since the 1980s. Besides English, the mother tongue, Mandarin, Malay, Tamil, are considered as a cultural anchor of Asian values and an ethnic marker. We must underline something here. When we speak about mother tongues, as regards Chinese, we always refer to Mandarin, not to Hokkien, not to Hakka, not to Teochew. Although, as I explained earlier, Mandarin was strictly speaking not a mother tongue in 1957. So in Singapore, we have a kind of glocalization with English for the global and Mandarin, Malay, Tamil for the local. This plurilingualism is displayed everywhere in the private space, in shops or in malls, in museums. Museums are not private places. In the public space too, everywhere, in the streets, in the MRT, etc., etc. So always 4 languages: English, Chinese. No need to make any difference between Mandarin and other Chinese languages when it comes to the script. Malay, which is the same as the Malaysian Malay. So the standard Malay standard in Singapore is the same as it is in Brunei and the same as it is in Malaysia. And lastly, Tamil. Although very few people are able to read and to speak Tamil. In schools, the Anglicization of schools actually began before the independence. 50% of the school used English as the teaching language in the late 1950s. But after the independence, you have 2 kinds of languages used at school: English for teaching and mother tongues as taught languages. Each one is taught in English and has to learn its own mother tongue, which is quite artificial, actually, especially when you have a child, when the parents are Hokkien-speaking people, he has to learn Mandarin at school, which is an additional language. And although it's not, strictly speaking, its own mother tongue. It's a very competitive education system, and the competition is partly based on the command of the languages. The best pupils, the best students in primary and secondary school are at that time, until the 90s, were given the opportunity to learn not only mother tongue and English, but to learn an additional foreign language like German or French or Japanese. And regarding the two specific languages are important in terms of policy. First is Mandarin, and second one is English. So we begin with Mandarin. As an example of state interventionism, in 1979 began the Speak Mandarin campaign with the idea of the elimination of Chinese dialects, which were perceived as a threat for the unity of the Chinese community. As a consequence, dialects almost disappeared, and to say it more roughly, the grandchildren now are unable to communicate with their own grandparents. Grandparents will speak Hokkien or Hakka, and the children or grandchildren will only be able to speak, and not very well, to speak Mandarin, but not the language of their own grandparents. This was a great achievement, but with, as a consequences, difficulties in communicating with all people who do not master, who do not speak very well, who refuse to speak Mandarin. The second example of state interventionism is the Speak Good English movement, launched in 2000. The idea was to promote standard English against Singlish, which is a Creole mixing English, Chinese, Malay, which is socially marked too, which is mastered by all, compared to English. British Standard English is mastered mainly by people who have got higher education, but for the others, it's not very well mastered. They don't have the really good command of English, but everyone can speak Singlish. And the point of view of the state is Singlish is gibberish, and beside this, Singlish is not really usable at working places. So people need to learn and to speak standard or British English instead of just Singlish. On the contrary, for the intellectuals and for the intellectual and cultural elite of Singapore, Singlish expresses a local identity and should be preserved and developed due to this main reason. So this is to give figures about the language changes. You can see the rise of English. the rise of Mandarin in the Chinese community, the reduced use of Malay, including its own community, and various fates of Indian languages. Here is the representation of Ex-Glosia in Singapore, with English at the center, Singlish in the special places, and Mandarin and Malay as the Tamil as recognized by co-official languages. The other languages, although may be spoken by a large part of the communities, like Bengali or Punjabi or Indonesian too, are not at all recognized. Continuing that on that slide, I just would like to show here that English now is shifting from an inter-community tool and is become now an intra-community tool. It's a social marker. So for the higher middle class, English is increasingly used inside families. So you have a growing percentage of the younger generation who learns and who speaks English at home as a mother tongue. Those small children who speak English with the parents, they will learn Chinese and Mandarin at school, and they won't speak it before entering schools. This is the main feature I have to underline with these slides. So, what could be the future development of the language landscape in Singapore? You have a diversity of languages, and we must make a difference between accepted, recognized diversity and real diversity. Accepted and recognized diversity is English, Mandarin, Tamil, and Malay. Real diversity is English, Singlish, Mandarin, Hokkien, Teochew, Malay, Indonesian, Tamil, Punjabi, Bengali, Nepali, etc., etc. Within the broader context of Anglicization of the society. The question is, how sustainable is and will be the position of Mandarin? If English becomes a mother tongue, should the definition of mother tongue be changed? Or what could be the fate of the so-called mother tongue in the education system in the future? So, as the last word on Singapore, we can ask how far the state shapes the language behavior of individuals and society. Because we've seen in Singapore a very proactive policy, but with impasses, with errors, a process of trial and errors, and a very reactive policy, but the results are not always the expected ones. And finally, I would like to synthesize my presentation today with this table. You have 4 nation states: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, and you have different characteristics of it regarding the language. First, the broader frame of the nation and communities, official languages, the narrative regarding languages, the social linguistics of Malay, status of it, and the position of English. Clearly, there is a huge difference, a divide between the former Dutch colony and the former British colonies or protectorates. Clearly, no notion of race, no communities, neither races nor communities in Indonesia, and a structuration, a partition of the society based on races in Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, with equal positions, theoretical equal positions in Singapore, and unequal positions in Malaysia and Brunei. You have the specific case of Singapore with 4 official languages, one national one, Malay, and the other countries only recognize one language as national and official language. The narrative for language is really important. It's quite strong in Indonesia, as well as in Singapore and Brunei. It's clearly very weak in Malaysia, because we don't know what the positioning of Malay or Malaysian there. Is it the language of the whole national community when it is called Bahasa Malaysia, Malaysian language, or is it the language owned by one single community when it's called Malay or Bahasa Melayu? How far the Malay people, the Malay community, is ready to share the language or not? Many Malay, they don't want to share the language. And therefore, in the urban context, they prefer to communicate in English with people from other communities. So Malay in Malaysia itself is not clearly a shared language. It's not shared at all in Singapore. On the contrary, in Indonesia, Malay, called Indonesian, is the language of no one. It's not really a mother tongue, although its position as a mother tongue is growing. But it's in the same time, in Indonesia, the same language is the language of everyone. It's owned by everyone. When we refer to Malay, specifically to Malay itself, in Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, it's the name of the national language. But Malay in Indonesia doesn't refer to the national language. The national language is called Indonesian. This word, Malay, in Indonesia only refers to local and regional Malays. And finally, we see the legacy of the colonials regarding English, an important role until now, and growing role played in the former British colonies and protectorate, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei. In Indonesia, the colonial legacy, Dutch, has completely disappeared, actually, almost completely disappeared, and English doesn't play an important role. Most of the Indonesian people don't speak English. In the elites, it's changing now, but clearly, English is not a threat for the national language as it can be seen and as it is in Malaysia, in Brunei, and in Singapore. Thank you. This was my last slide. I finished. So if you have questions, I'm ready to try to answer to it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jérôme. For the first part of the Q&A, I will be presiding over. Before we start with the open forum, may we just remind everyone, to those who will want or who will request for their certificates of attendance, please answer the evaluation form flashed under our screen or on the comment section of the UP Department of Linguistics Facebook page and YouTube channel. Also, you may now post your questions on the comments section of the Facebook page and YouTube channel of the Department of Linguistics. You are still tuned in to the Talks on Asian Languages featuring Dr. Jérôme Samuel with his talk titled Comparing Language Policies in Malay-speaking Countries. Now, I would like to start the Q&A portion with this question. In the Philippines, we can see a number of pockets of communities that speak Bahasa Indonesia Malaysia, especially in towns that are just a ferry ride away from the borders. I think these are in the southern part of the Philippines particularly. Have you encountered these situations in your current study? And can you tell us about the linguistic situation in those areas?
Yes, thank you. Well, unfortunately, it's difficult for me to answer this question because the only time I went to the Philippines, which was really a very enriching experience, it was in late April, last April. So I have no knowledge of these communities. I even have no idea whether they are migrant workers or people living there for generations. I don't really know. I don't know what language they are using. Is it Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Malaysia, or is it a local Malay? And I would say that most probably they don't use standard Malay, Indonesian or Malaysian at home. I'm pretty sure that they rather use the substandard of or local dialects.
Yeah, thank you. I think it also for more information, since Sabah is much closer to the Mindanao area of south of the Philippines, there are two bahasa or there are two languages in Malaysia that are currently at play. For example, in a town in Sulu, for example, most radio stations will be coming from Malaysia. So the languages that they speak, the language that they will speak is Bahasa Malaysia. However, when they do trading with people in Sabah, these people would use Kadasan Dusun language. So there are two languages at play
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
Maybe I would like yes, thank you for this additional information. Maybe well, I want to elaborate on the relation between Indonesian and Malaysian today, but what needs to explain is first, Malaysian or Malay spoken in Sabah and Sarawak is much closer to kind of Indonesian compared to Malay in the peninsula. So when you come from Indonesia, it's easier to speak and to understand what is said by people in Sabah and Sarawak. Same accent, same spellings, same stress on words.
Lexicon. Yeah.
Yes, lexicon differs slightly, but it's much easier to understand them compared to the people living in the peninsula, which is clearly diverging. But besides this, the Malay spoken in the peninsula and spoken in the eastern and northern coast of Sumatra are very close one to the other. So when you cross the straits, and when you are native speaker of Malay, you don't need to change or to adapt for anything. So a Malay speaker from Perak, for instance, or for the west coast of the peninsula, will be at home when he is in Sumatra. And as well, Malay speaker from Medan, in the northern part of Jambi, on the east coast of Sumatra, he will also be at home speaking regarding the language when he is on the peninsula.
Thank you, Dr. Jerome. Now I am passing the mic to Isko Rosario, who is our moderator for this morning. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Jerome, for that very insightful presentation. You mentioned that, of course, language is a political issue, and it's interesting to note that the Japanese language is the dominant language in Indonesia before the birth of the Indonesian nation. So why is it that the government still use Malay as the basis of its national language? Of course, you mentioned a while ago that it's widely spoken compared to Japanese, but was that the only reason during that time?
I mean, to the choice of Malay instead of Javanese.
Yes.
At that time in the 1930s, or at the time of the independence, or until now?
The independence.
Yeah. Yes, it's quite surprising because most of the political elite in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s until the 1950s, they were Javanese. If you see the name of the people having working as ministers or working in the administration, the highest traits of the higher position of the administration, they're all Javanese, almost all Javanese. And until now, when you go to some offices in ministries, when the people are just discussing in a comfortable way, they will quickly shift to Javanese instead of using Indonesian. I have experienced the same in Bali too, when having to deal with to solve a problem, the problem in an inspiration for the in the local administration in Bali, where people were speaking in Indonesian with me, but between themselves they were speaking a Balinese language, for instance.
Mhm.
So the local languages are always very close to the national one. Now, returning to the choice, I think that although there were very few Malay people in the elite at that time, they were able to explain to the Javanese that the choice of Javanese language was unacceptable by the people living outside of Java.
Mhm.
And not only outside of Java, because in Java, in the western part of the island, the main local language is not Javanese, it's Sundanese. And Sundanese is really different, no mutual intelligibility with Javanese. And the Javanese were clever enough to understand that and to, well, they give up with their own language. It was maybe easy for them to give up because most of them had only a distant relationship with Javanese. They grew up with Dutch. The language for reflection, for the work, and for the political activities was Dutch, not Javanese. Additionally, there is another reason given by the Indonesian, but for me, it's not very convincing. The fact that in Javanese, we have a very intense use of honorifics with
Yes.
levels.
Yeah. Mhm.
And you have always to place yourself, hierarchically speaking, with
Mhm.
the others. Are you above or under him or her? It's very important. This is linguistically difficult to master, to command. You have to learn the
Yeah.
lexicon, specific
Mhm.
lexicon. And beside this, in the frame of a democratic country, it's not really acceptable. In a democratic country, everyone is equal.
Mhm.
You shouldn't have to make any differentiation with A or B or C because he or she is higher or under you.
Mhm.
And what we see now is the decline, besides the decline of regional languages, generally speaking, but the decline, a sharp decline of the use of these honorifics in Javanese and in Sundanese.
Mhm.
If you
Okay,
do not
so
master these honorifics in many situations, in Sundanese speaking countries, Javanese or Balinese, if you do not master it, you have two choices. First, shift to Indonesian or substandard, and second one, just to close your mouth. And it's not
so
acceptable too.
okay, so it could be the complicated like levels or registers of Japanese could be a factor.
Yeah, yeah.
Why it was
But
not considered.
it's very antagonistic. The idea of democracy with the use of a language with
Oh, yes.
levels, as it is the case in Japanese. We
Yeah.
have the fact that Indonesian is a republic, is a democratic, not a democrat, it's a republic. It's not a kingdom.
Mhm.
Malaysia is a federation of kingdoms.
Mhm.
Brunei is a kingdom. Indonesia as well as Singapore are republics, and it's important.
Okay. Now let's go to Malaysia. And you've mentioned that the Malays have become the minority because of that massive migratory flows of Indians and Chinese. And even the name of the national language changed from Bahasa Melayu and to Bahasa Malaysia, then to Malayu to Malaysia again. So what does this indicate about the social social cultural situation in the country or the dynamics among these races?
Well, um, the Malaysia since the late 50s, since the 50s, and since the mid 20th century, is experiencing a very difficult and uncomfortable and dangerous situation because the state is based on these communities, which are mainly racial communities and secondarily speaking language communities. So it's difficult. People, they will position themselves as member of the communities much more than as member of the national community as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask someone, a Malaysian, what's your nationality, he will or she will answer Malaysian with no hesitation. They will not define themselves as Chinese Malaysian or Indian Malaysian or Malay Malaysians. The main problem, I would say, in Malaysia are the Malays themselves. They don't really want to share their place in the country. They don't want to share the language. And when I'm speaking of the Malays, to be more specific again, what's the problem comes from the elites, mainly from the political elites. On the grassroots level, there is no problem between Malays and Chinese. They will communicate, they will use, and they will use the language called BM, as I mentioned, avoiding Bahasa Malaysia, avoiding Bahasa Melayu. Bahasa Malaysia is the language of everyone, which is refused by part of all communities. Some Chinese too will refuse this term, Bahasa Malaysia, and avoiding the term of Bahasa Melayu, who is clearly considered as owned by the Malays themselves. One consequence of this policy, racial and language policy, is the fact that the Malay-speaking Chinese people have been expelled from Malayness. Until the 1950s and 60s, you still had, at that time, Chinese people from Malacca, for instance, who were writing novelists, Chinese novelists, writing in Malay. It wasn't a problem for them. Now it's not possible anyway. Chinese novelists will write in Mandarin or in English, rather in English. And the only ones who will be using Malay as a language to write novels are the Malays themselves. I don't know if I have answered the question. Maybe not really.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We have this comment from Dr. Aljon Lee. Yes, Dr. Aljon Lee. I'd like to ask, though, if Malay language studies in higher educational institutions is flourishing and if the Malaysian government is supportive of it. So is curious if the teaching of Malay to children is available in all four nation states.
So in higher educational institution, there is no place anymore for Malay in the higher educational system in Singapore, not at all. In Malaysia, it depends on the topics, the disciplines. So, and it depends on the program you are following. But mostly people are taught in English, mostly in English, much less in Malay. It's the same in Brunei. There is a big difference between Brunei and Malaysia. I would say that Bruneian students have a better command of English compared to Malaysian students, to Malay from Malaysia. Bruneian have a better command of it. They have a better British English compared to the Malaysians. But if you are learning literature or religion or history, it will be partly or completely taught in Malay. For courses related to technology, informatics, physics, mathematics, sciences, no way. It's everything's taught in English, which is not the case in Indonesia.
Yes. That's my question. My follow-up question, because you mentioned a while ago that Malay is competing with English in cities. Do you see this as well in Indonesia? or is it between
No, no. There is in Indonesia. There is a demand. There is a need for English, especially for the higher middle class. People are interested in putting their children in schools, in private schools, where they will get English lessons at a very young age. And if they can, they will send the children in universities in Australia, for instance, or sometimes in Malaysia or in Singapore, but mainly in Australia. So yes, people are asking for more, getting more English, but there is no competition between English and Indonesian in Indonesia. So in the country itself, no. Abroad, it's different. And for instance, where Indonesian people are traveling in Malaysia, they will use English to communicate with Malaysian instead of with Malay instead of Indonesian. But this is another question.
No.
There is a question here.
Yes. From Alex.
Could you display it?
Yeah, we have this question from Alex. So what is the status of Malay varieties like Sarawak Malay or BM? And is using BM in Sarawak viewed negatively, or does it mark a speaker as an outsider, for example?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in Malaysia. Some dialects have not a status, but their existence is acknowledged by the state, and you will find a lot of researchers on dialectology on Cantonese Malay, Johor Malay. Johor Malay is the most prestigious variant, but Cantonese Malay, Perak Malay, Terengganu Malay. This is of interest for the linguists in Malaysia. It's different with Sarawak Malay. It's different. Sarawak Malay is not really a vernacular. The vernaculars in Sarawak are Bidayu, Iban, and other languages. Sarawak Malay is a vehicular, but it's a regional vehicular. It's a vehicular used in Sarawak, in all the state of Sarawak. Not only and not specifically for given communities. The Bidayu will speak in Bidayu. And when a Bidayu has to speak with a Malay or to speak with someone from another community, he will shift to Sarawak Malay. So it's what I call regional vehicular Malays. You will find the same kind of vehicular Malays in Indonesia, for instance, with Hainanese Malay, which is used in the northern part of Sulawesi by people whose mother tongue is not Malay.
Okay. So before we close this session this morning, a few years ago there were some articles that I read suggesting Bahasa Indonesia, or I think Indonesia, being suggested to be the official language of the ASEAN region. So your thoughts on that, Dr. Jérôme?
Yes, it's this. You will hear here, but this idea repeatedly. It's put by some people in Malaysia as well as in Indonesia. In Malaysia, there was a strong will in the 1990s. Indonesia more recently. I think it's unthinkable. Indonesian can be used as a common language at the level of ASEAN. Before reaching that step, Indonesian and Malaysian should accept and should define a single Malay variant to be used by other countries and other people in the region. I mean, in Southeast Asia. So it's just put up by people who want to make noise or to make to publicize themselves. It's not serious at all.
Yeah, but it could be, one of the possible reasons for us to be more encouraged to learn Bahasa Malay or Indonesian. All right. So on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Jérôme, for addressing the questions from our audience. But before we end the event, we'd like to present this certificate of appreciation to
Okay.
Dr. Jérôme Samuel for delivering a lecture titled Comparing Language Policies in Malay-speaking countries from colonial legacies to political will and constraints as part of the talks on Asian languages organized by the UP Department of Linguistics, given this 25th of July 2023, signed by the Department Chair of the Department of Linguistics, Dr. Maria Cristina Gallego. Okay, thank you
Thank you.
very much. Okay, so that's it for our TAL session today. Thank you, Dr. Jerome, and everyone who's tuned in. For those who tune in late, this lecture will be available on our official social media platforms. And for the details of the upcoming events and activities in commemoration of the centennial anniversary of the department, please check our official social media accounts. And by the way, the 15th Philippine Linguistics Congress will be held on August 23 to 25, 2023. So we hope to see you there. Thank you and keep safe.